Chapter 14 The Sad Truth. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, Roz stayed up with her computer and researched sneaky subjects. She looked for diagrams of her own body, for maps of the area, and for any news that might help her escape. But the robot found nothing. The computer only let her access information about farming. She was cut off from the outside world. It was clear that if Roz wanted to escape from her new life, she would need help. But the cows didn't know how to escape, and Mr. Sharif would never let his robot leave. Who would possibly help Roz run away from the farm? Chapter 15 The Children. As time rolled by, Roz saw less and less of Mr. Sharif, but she saw more and more of the children. They were shy at first. The robot might look up from the pasture and see Jad peeking around the corner of the barn, or see Jaya spying from the branches of the tree. But the children were growing bolder. And then one day, Roz marched into the workshop and heard giggling. She walked to the closet in the back, opened the door, and there was Jaya, smiling and trying not to laugh. "I'm hiding from my brother," whispered the girl. "Close the door." The robot closed the door. A minute later, Jad ran in, flushed and out of breath. "Hey, Roz, have you seen Jaya?" The robot just stared. "I know she's in here," said Jad, and he began prowling around the room. He searched under the work table and behind the tool chest and between all the bulky workshop machines, and finally he marched up to Roz and said, "I order you to show me where my sister is hiding." The robot pointed to the closet. Jad smiled mischievously and tiptoed over, and then he flung open the door and screamed, "Found you!" "No fair," Jaya whined. "Roz showed you where I was hiding." The girl scowled at the robot. "That wasn't very nice, Roz. But you can make it up to me by playing hide and seek. Okay, count to 100 and then try to find my brother and me, okay?" There was a brief pause. Then the robot said, "Okay." Jaya and Jad squealed with delight and scampered out the door as Roz started counting. The robot's sensitive ears listened carefully to the children outside. She heard quick footsteps crunching across the driveway. She heard a giggle and the sounds of tree branches shaking. She heard a grunt and the sounds of hay bales being shoved aside. And when the robot finished counting, it took her exactly 5 seconds to find Jaya up in a tree, and it took her another 8 seconds to find Jad in the hayloft. "Wow, Roz is really good at seeking," said Jad as he picked hay from his hair. Jaya snorted. "Yeah, well, let's just see how good she is at hiding." Now Roz was even better at hiding, and while the children counted, the robot silently slipped away, and an hour later they still had not found her. The siblings stood in the driveway, defeated. "We give up, Roz!" shouted Jad. "You win!" shouted Jaya. The junk pile beside the barn started moving, and Roz appeared. The robot had been sitting there all along, perfectly camouflaged among the scrap metal and the old farm machines. "The next time we play, you have to let one of us win," said Jaya to Roz. And the next time they played, Roz did. The robot enjoyed having the children around. They brought a little lightness to her world, and she hoped that she would bring a little lightness to theirs. Life must have been dark since their mother passed away. However, Roz had another reason for wanting the children around. She needed them. Her only chance of ever returning home was if Jaya and Jad could find it in their hearts to help her escape. But this was a delicate situation. If Roz tried too hard, the children might say something to their father. And if she didn't try hard enough, she might be stuck on that farm forever. Chapter 16 The Robot's Dream. Cows grazed in the pasture. Wind rustled through the tall grass. Clouds drifted over the fields. Farm machines rumbled and buzzed. Milk flowed into bottles. Bottles were packed into boxes. Boxes were loaded onto the milk truck. The truck drove away full and returned empty. Children romped around with their dog. A man sat at his desk. A robot dreamed of Chapter 17. The Birds. Hilltop Farm was home to many birds. Swallows were always swooping low over the grass and picking off insects. Crows cawed from the fields like a gang of hecklers. At night, owls glided above the countryside, silently searching for furry little meals. The robot was stuck on that farm, but the birds were free to go wherever they pleased. Lucky birds. One day, Roz was standing in the pasture, admiring a hawk as he soared through the sky, when the cows began grazing around her. Their slow footsteps crunched in the grass, their teeth chewed and chewed, their tails flicked at flies, and all the while Roz stood there staring up at the hawk. And then Lily's soft voice. "What are you thinking about, Roz?" The robot turned to the calf. "I am thinking about Brightbill," she said. "It was not so long ago that I was watching my son soar through the sky. That seems like another lifetime." "You must hate your new life," said Annabelle. "I can't say that I blame you. Farming looks like grueling work." "Actually, I like farming," said Roz. "Somehow, it feels right to spend long hours working with machines and tools and crops and animals. But I do miss my old life on the island." Tess had a mouthful of dandelions, but that didn't stop her from speaking. "Oh, maybe you should start thinking of this farm as your home. That island is far away. There's a good chance you'll never make it back there." "Don't say that," cried Lily. "Roz just has to make it home. She has to be with Brightbill and with her friends." "Tess is right," said Roz. "I may never make it home. If I were a bird, like my son, I could fly home all on my own any time I wanted. But I am only a robot." Nobody spoke after that. The cows went back to grazing, and Roz went back to admiring the hawk. Her eyes followed the bird as he soared through the sky, free to go wherever he pleased. Chapter 18. The Entertaining Robot. The children wandered out behind the farm buildings, through a clearing and over to an old oak tree. It was the same tree that their father had climbed in when he was a boy. Mr. Sharif's initials were carved into the bark, and it was at the bottom of a long list of initials. For generations, all of the Sharifs had carved their initials into that tree, going back to their ancestors who had first built that farm. Someday the children would add their initials to the list. Beneath the leafy branches was a scattering of acorns. Jad cleared a spot for himself, sat down, and pulled a small computer from his pocket while Jaya climbed above. The siblings would spend the afternoon there, lazing around the tree until the robot marched past, carrying the big, heavy toolbox. "Hey, what you doing, Roz?" called Jad. The robot stopped. "The drone has crash-landed again," she said. "I am going to fix it again." "Well, do you need any help?" "I do not need any help." "I'm bored," said Jaya, her legs dangling above her brother's head. Can we do something fun, Roz?" The robot put down her toolbox and said, "What would you like me to do?" "I don't know," said Jaya, thinking hard. "Can you do a backflip?" "Yes, I can do a backflip." A grin spread across the girl's face. "Roz, I order you to do a backflip." And at that, Roz crouched and she leaped into the air, flipped backward, and gently landed on her feet. A perfect backflip. Jad put his computer away. Jaya jumped down from her branch. The children were impressed. "What else can you do?" said Jad. "Can you juggle?" "Yes, I can juggle." "Well, I order you to juggle some of these acorns." Roz walked up to the tree, picked 3 large acorns from the ground, and began to juggle them in perfect rhythm. Jaya studied the robot's movements, and then she began to toss acorns into the air as well. The first one went a little too high, and the next one went a little too far, and soon they all went tumbling back into the grass. "Well, do you know any jokes?" asked Jad. "Why did the chicken cross the road?" "Never mind," Jad scratched his head. "Well, can you tell us a story?" "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "A robot story," said Jad. "An animal story," said Jaya. "How about a robot and animal story?" said Roz. The children smiled at each other. Then they sat up against the tree and looked up at their robotic storyteller. Once upon a time, there was a robot who lived alone on an island, Roz began. She spent her time wandering across mountains and forests and meadows, and then something terrible happened. Rocks fell and the robot tumbled off a cliff. She survived the fall, but sadly, the rocks killed 2 geese and smashed 4 of their eggs. The robot stood there staring at the poor goose family until she heard a tiny voice peeping from somewhere nearby. She followed the peeping voice and discovered a perfect goose egg sunk into the dirt. The robot carefully picked up the egg and carried it away, and when the gosling hatched from his shell, the first thing he saw was the robot looking back. "Mama, Mama," he peeped. The gosling thought the robot was his mother, and from that day on, she was. The robot adopted the gosling as her son, and together they made a funny little happy family. The end. The children sat there and thought about Roz's strange story. Then they looked up at her and said, "What happened next?" Chapter 19. The Storytellers. Roz and the children had a new routine. Several times a week they would gather beneath the oak tree and Roz would tell stories about the robot on the island. The children loved hearing about how the robot survived mudslides and bear attacks and harsh winter weather. They loved hearing about how she befriended the island animals. But the story that they loved most were about the robot and her son, the goose. He sounded like such a nice goose. Roz told the children story after story after story. And what she didn't tell them, what she couldn't tell them, was that the stories were true and that they were about her. The children wanted to get in on the storytelling fun. Jaya told adventure stories about dragons and monsters. Jad told silly stories about aliens in outer space. But as the children grew more comfortable with Roz, they began to talk about their own lives. They talked about growing up way out in the country. They talked about their schoolmates and their friends and their family, and they talked about how their parents used to work together around the farm and how perfect everything was before the accident. In an instant, their lives had been upended. Their mother was gone and their father was injured. Mr. Sharif tried to keep the farm going by himself, but there was so much to do and he was so weak now. The farm machines powered along doing their jobs as usual, but they needed to be maintained and monitored. And eventually the machines started breaking down and the farm started falling to pieces. The children wondered if life would ever feel normal again. "And that's why we got you, Roz," said the girl. "We needed you to save this place." "And that's exactly what you're doing," said the boy with a smile. Chapter 20. The Wild Animals. Wildlife can be very good for farmland. Insects pollinate plants, snakes eat pests. The droppings of rodents and birds and every other animal act as a natural fertilizer. Roz wanted more of these helpful creatures on the farm, so she let the unused sections of land go wild. Up from the ground emerged native weeds, flowers, woody brambles, and with the wild plants came wild animals. And then some creatures came skulking around who were not helpful at all. It started when Roz noticed a heavy scent floating on the breeze. She followed the scent out to a narrow strip of forest on the edge of the property. There were clumps of fur in the undergrowth and claw marks in the dirt, and there was blood, too. Lots of it. And then she found the carcass. A deer had recently been killed and eaten. The robot's head slowly spun around as she scanned the area. Not far from the carcass was a pile of droppings. Looked like they might have come from a dog, but Oscar wasn't large enough or ferocious enough to kill a deer. What kind of animal could have done this? Roz had been standing there at the edge of the property for a while, and she imagined Mr. Sharif sitting in his office at his computer, eyeing her location on the map. Any minute now, he would hobble out to his truck and come racing down the driveway to check on her. Roz didn't want to upset the man, so she left the carcass where it was and returned to her work. But from then on, she kept a careful watch for any signs of trouble. Chapter 21. The Howl. It wasn't long before Roz found more signs of trouble. furry faces poking out from the bushes, musky smells lingering in the fields, silhouettes trotting through the midnight moonlight. And then one night she heard it. Ooh, the long, menacing howl of a wolf. Chapter 22. The Wolves. The attack happened at dusk. 7 beastly shapes bounded over the fence and into the pasture. Old Annabel had wandered off from the herd, and now she made an easy target. The herding machine saw the wolves coming and rolled in their direction, but the hunters were clever. They split up, darted past the clunky machine, and surrounded their target. The wolf pack was led by a large male. His name was Shadow, and it was easy to see why. He was quick and quiet and covered in dark fur, except for a long, pale scar that streaked across his body like a comet. Shadow locked eyes with the cow, distracting her with his fierce gaze, and when his pack was into position, he said, "Attack!" The wolves lunged, snapping their jaws at the cow's skinny legs. Annabel kicked and hollered, "Stay away from me, you brutes!" And she was a big animal. But the wolves knew what to do. They kept biting her, kept taunting her, kept wearing her down. The herd watched from afar. They cried out to their friend. They wanted to help, but they were too frightened to move. Well, reader, you can guess who came to the rescue. Footsteps thundered across the pasture, and Roz leaped into the fight. Had she swung her fist or kicked her feet, the wolf pack might have fled, but the robot was not programmed to be violent. All she could do was awkwardly defend the cow. Roz felt teeth chomping onto her arm. She felt claws slashing onto her chest. Her pain sensors flared, and she howled, "Leave us alone!" The robot's booming voice startled the wolves, and in that instant she pried one of them away. Then Annabel landed a hard kick, and another wolf tumbled backward into the grass. More help was coming. The other cows had finally found their courage, and the angry herd was on the march. The wolves had missed their chance. Shadow gave a frustrated grunt, and the pack retreated. They dashed through the pasture, leaped over the fence, and disappeared into the trees. The robot activated her headlights, and shafts of light beamed out from her eyes. While the herd crowded around, Roz carefully examined Annabel's injuries. "I need to clean and dress these bite wounds," said the robot, "but you will be okay." "Of course I'll be okay," the cow panted. "I'm old, but I'm feisty. Those wolves don't scare me." And Annabel talked tough, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. All of the cows were afraid. They knew that if the wolves attacked again, their next victim might not be so fortunate.